By the late 1970s, Chrysler Corporation was in genuine freefall. Not the kind of freefall where a company has a bad quarter and tightens its belt. We're talking about the kind where the lights are flickering and people are wondering whether the whole thing is going to exist in 12 months. Debt was piling up, market share was eroding, and consumer confidence in the brand had basically evaporated. It was catastrophic for one of the big three American automakers. Into this mess stepped Lee Iacocca. Fresh off a very public and bitter dismissal from Ford, Iacocca arrived at Chrysler with a reputation, a clear plan, and absolutely no patience for half measures. His vision for saving the company wasn't complicated, but it required discipline Chrysler had been sorely lacking. Standardize the platforms, go front-wheel drive, build efficient, interconnected vehicles that share parts and keep costs down. That became the K-car strategy, and it was precisely that family of practical, fuel-conscious cars that dragged Chrysler back from the edge and turned Iacocca into a genuine American business legend. But here's the thing about Lee Iacocca. He wasn't only thinking about survival. Even while building the infrastructure to keep Chrysler alive, he had a more ambitious idea in his head, one about image rather than economics. He wanted a flagship, a halo car for Dodge. Something that would announce to the world that this wasn't just a company trying to stay alive, but a company with real ambition and style. And that car was the Dodge Mirada. On paper, the Mirada made a certain kind of sense. Through most of the 1970s, the personal luxury coupe had been one of the hottest segments in the American market. Big, stylish two-door cars that sat between a muscle car and a proper luxury vehicle. The Monte Carlo, the Grand Prix, the Thunderbird, these cars were selling in massive numbers. Iacocca saw an opening for Dodge. The Mirada was meant to be the spiritual successor to the Dodge Magnum, but leaner and more refined. A proper statement car. The problem, and this is what makes the Mirada's story so painfully interesting, was timing. By the time Chrysler committed to bringing it to market, the world the Mirada had been designed for was already shifting. The fuel crisis had fundamentally changed what Americans wanted from their cars. Suddenly, fuel economy wasn't a nice-to-have. It was the primary consideration for millions of buyers. The appetite for big, heavy, thirsty personal luxury coupes was cooling fast. Launching the Mirada in 1980 into that environment was a little like opening a print-only newspaper in 2026. The product wasn't necessarily terrible. The moment was just brutally wrong. Still, Chrysler pushed forward, and the Mirada wasn't without genuine appeal. The exterior was handled by designer Ernie Brower's team, and they swung for something genuinely distinctive. They drew inspiration from one of the most legendary pre-war American automobiles, the Cord 810, famous for its coffin-nose front end, that pointed, slatted grille that made it look like nothing else on the road when it debuted in 1936. Brower's team reinterpreted that for the Mirada, and the result was a bold, pointed front fascia that gave the car a retro forward elegance that was actually pretty compelling. The grille itself was fabricated from a flexible plastic material, which was genuinely forward-thinking for the era. Whatever else you want to say about the Mirada, the front end had character. This is also where Iacocca's personal taste started wrestling with the design team's direction. Brower and his colleagues had a relatively modern vision, something that leaned into that distinctive nose with a cleaner overall aesthetic. But Iacocca had a well-known preference for traditional luxury cues and pushed for the Mirada to carry a vinyl landau roof. That padded top look, the universal shorthand for American luxury throughout the 60s and 70s. The design team almost certainly would have left it off. But Iacocca wanted it, and so a significant number of Miradas left the factory wearing that padded roof that already felt dated at the moment of launch. Chrysler at least gave buyers some flexibility. Painted roof, T-tops, or the full landau, pick your poison. It meant the car had a split identity, simultaneously trying to be modern and classic, sporty and plush, which, honestly, was a pretty accurate reflection of Chrysler's own internal confusion during this period. The company was reinventing itself with one hand while trying to hold on to its existing customer base with the other. Inside, the Murata continued that same blend. Brushed aluminum instrument panel was standard, optional faux wood grain for the traditionalists. Seating ranged from sport cloth buckets to a 60-40 split bench, and at the top of the range in CMX trim, full leather, 8-track and cassette options, a 30-watt amplifier. Reasonable creature comforts for a personal luxury coupe. From an engineering standpoint, and here's where it gets interesting, despite the new sheet metal, the car underneath was far from cutting edge. The Murata was built on Chrysler's aging J-body platform, itself a reworked version of older F-body underpinnings that had already served under cars like the Dodge Aspen. So while the Murata looked new in a showroom, the bones were considerably more seasoned. A deliberate cost control decision, developing an entirely new platform, would have taken money Chrysler simply didn't have. The result stretched 112.7 inches between the axles and came in at just under 210 inches total. Real street presence. And despite all that visual heft, the Murata was about 800 pounds lighter than the 1979 Dodge Magnum it replaced. A genuine engineering achievement, even if the car was still no lightweight. Now, if you're the kind of person who finds yourself watching deep dives on cars most people have completely forgotten, you already know this isn't a channel that wastes your time. Subscribing is how you make sure the algorithm actually puts the next one in front of you. Because without that signal, it goes to someone else instead of you. Under the hood, the Murata launched with 3 engine choices, and the range told you everything about where the American auto industry stood in 1980. The base was a 3.7-liter slant 6, making around 90 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. Legendarily durable in a compact car. In a nearly 2-ton personal luxury coupe, a genuinely rough situation. 0 to 60 in a slant 6 Murata took around 16 seconds. Some economy hatchbacks of that era were quicker. If you found yourself behind the wheel of one, you were not merging confidently onto any highway. Step up to the 318 cubic inch V8 and things improved. Around 120 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque. A meaningful improvement in low-end response. But by 1980, American V8s had been thoroughly worked over by tightening emissions regulations, and the result was a generation of engines that kept some torque character while losing most of their genuine performance. The 318 moved the Murata adequately. It was not going to excite anyone. Then, there was the 360 cubic inch V8, and in 1980, if you found one and checked the right boxes, this was the only Murata truly worth considering. It produced 185 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque, and in the context of a car that had so little going for it dynamically, that extra pull was enormously welcome. The problem was that it was fleeting. Due to emissions compliance requirements, the 360 was discontinued across all Chrysler vehicles after 1980. One model year. From 1981 forward, the 318 was the biggest engine you could get. Every engine was paired to Chrysler's 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic. Smooth, reliable, got the job done. The car ran rear-wheel drive, but the final drive ratio was tuned very tall, more highway cruiser than anything approaching spirited driving. Combine that with modest power outputs, and you had a car that never felt eager, regardless of which engine sat under that long hood. Chrysler offered an optional sport handling package, heavier shocks, stiffer springs, thicker anti-roll bars. Those components genuinely improved things at the margins. But they also underscored the central contradiction running through the entire Murata project. The designers wanted something visually aggressive. Ayakaka wanted traditional luxury. Then, someone bolted on a sport handling package. Nobody ever quite settled on what this car was supposed to be, and that indecision showed in ways no suspension tune could fix. In fully loaded CMX specification with the 360, a 1980 Dodge Murata stickered at around $10,000. That put it squarely in the fight against the Monte Carlo, the Grand Prix, the Cutlass Supreme, and the Thunderbird. All cars with stronger brand momentum, better resale values, and sharper product identities. The sales numbers made that painfully clear. 1980 was the high watermark at 28,633 units. By 1981, that dropped to around 12,000, then roughly 6,800 in 1982, then approximately 5,500 in 1983. 4 years of production, 52,000 total units. The Monte Carlo was doing numbers like that in a single strong year. What made the situation even harder was that the personal luxury coupe segment hadn't completely collapsed during the Murata's run. Its competitors were still moving meaningful volume. The Murata didn't fail purely because the market was difficult. It failed because Dodge brought a car to a competitive fight and couldn't genuinely compete in it. But Ayakaka had one more card to play. Toward the end of 1980, he reached out to Richard Petty, the King, the most decorated driver in NASCAR history at that point, with a genuinely audacious proposal. He wanted Petty to take the Murata racing. If the car could find success on the superspeedways, it might inject some badly needed energy into the nameplate and the Dodge brand. Ayakaka committed to providing factory sheet metal and engine components. Petty's team would do the rest. The car was built, liveried up, and taken to Daytona in January of 1981 for testing. From a distance, it looked the part. Fully prepared, sharp livery, it looked like a proper racing machine. But the moment the team started running timed laps, they had a serious problem. The Murata's distinctive front end, that retro-inspired coffin nose that was such a visual asset on the street, was a genuine aerodynamic disaster at racing speeds. The drag numbers were terrible. Petty's Murata was running approximately 8 miles per hour slower than the Ford and GM cars it would have had to race against. On a NASCAR superspeedway, 8 miles per hour isn't a gap you close with setup changes or driver skill. It's a fundamental disadvantage. The car couldn't break 185 miles per hour on the banking. Petty's team switched to GM sheet metal almost immediately, and the Murata's factory NASCAR campaign was over before it had properly started. A handful of independent teams continued running Muratas on short tracks through the early 80s. Where superspeedway aerodynamics mattered less. They managed around 17 top 10 finishes, genuinely impressive without factory resources behind them. But it wasn't the kind of visibility that changes public perception, and it did nothing for the car's commercial story. By the end of 1983, the Murata was done, replaced by the front-wheel drive Dodge 600, a thoroughly practical vehicle aligned perfectly with everything the K-car philosophy stood for. Fuel-conscious, cost-effective, sensibly engineered for the market that actually existed rather than the one Chrysler had hoped was still there. The Murata's failure wasn't the story of a genuinely bad car. The styling had real merit. The Cord-inspired front end was legitimately distinctive. Some of the interior work was thoughtfully executed. In a different era, launched 5 years earlier into a more receptive market with a stronger engine lineup, the Murata might have been a fondly remembered chapter in Dodge history. But that version didn't happen. What happened instead was a car caught between two eras, built on old bones, styled with one foot in the past, launched into a market running in the opposite direction, competing against rivals with stronger identities and more resources. Ayakaka's gamble on the Murata was ultimately a sideshow during a period when Chrysler simply could not afford one. The K-cars saved the company. The Murata serves as a reminder that even sharp people, under enormous pressure, sometimes bet on the wrong horse at exactly the wrong moment. If this is the kind of automotive history you keep coming back to, the decisions that looked reasonable until they didn't, the cars that almost were, the moments where an entire company's trajectory turned on a single product call, then you already know what this channel is about. Every one of these videos exists because someone took a swing, and we're still talking about it decades later. Subscribe, and you'll be here for the next one. See you then, enthusiasts.